Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world where the columns are marble, the sandals are strapped, and freedom is mostly reserved for men named Themistocles who drink watered-down wine and argue for sport. You, however, are not one of them. You are owned, and your story begins in silence. You're about to follow the invisible lives that made ancient Greece run, not the philosophers, not the gods, but the people who did the cooking, mining, weaving, and walking quietly behind those who got the statues. This is the secret life of Greek slaves, and let's just say, you probably won't survive this without drifting off first. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the sound of voices you don't understand. They're arguing about you, but they don't bother including you in the conversation. Someone pokes your side, inspecting the curve of your shoulder like your livestock. You try to sit up, but your wrists ache from the ropes. The sea salt crusts your ankles. You're not quite sure how you got here, but it started with capture, maybe in war, maybe in a raid, maybe in a pirate ambush along some windswept coast. Doesn't really matter now. You belong to someone else. Welcome to ancient Greece, where freedom is a privilege and slavery is just Tuesday. You've been dragged from your home somewhere north, east, or west because most slaves in Greece are foreigners. Not always, but often. You might be Thracian, Scythian, Anatolian, or Illyrian. Your skin tone, your language, your hair, all of it becomes part of how you'll be labeled and valued. Historians still argue whether this foreignness made the enslavement feel less cruel to the Greeks or simply more convenient. After all, it's easier to justify subjugation when the person doesn't look or speak like you. You're marched inland, feet blistered, mouth dry toward a city you've never seen. Perhaps Athens, with its gleaming white stones and the smell of olives on the wind. You'd expect such a place to feel sacred, but to you it's a marketplace of decisions being made about you. You're taken to a holding pen, likely outdoors, near the agora. Other slaves sit or stand nearby, some stunned into silence, others whispering to one another in unfamiliar tongues. There are children clinging to strangers and older men staring blankly, unblinking. You're inspected again. Teeth checked, muscles flexed, back prodded. The auction begins. Your value depends on many things. Are you strong? Are you educated? Do you have a skill? Male slaves suited for hard labor are sold quickly. Female slaves might be headed for domestic roles or worse. Children are bought for their pliability. You overhear someone say a Greek-born slave fetches a higher price. Why? Because they're more likely to understand Greek customs and won't break the amphorae while sweeping. You're sold. Just like that. A quick exchange of coin, a nod, and a tug of the rope around your wrist. Your new owner doesn't look at you, not really. You are part of his household inventory, no more or less significant than the loom or the dog. You're not alone. Slavery is everywhere in ancient Greece. Some historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 people in Athens were slaves. That's not a side detail. That's the economic engine. Everything from democracy to pottery to battlefield logistics rests on unpaid, unfree labor. You make the city run, but your name may never be remembered. Unless, of course, you do something scandalous, or heroic, or mildly inconvenient. One odd fact you learn quickly in some polis. Like Sparta, Being enslaved isn't even personal. It's institutional. You're a Helot. Then you're born into servitude with no particular owner. Instead, the state owns you. A different kind of nightmare one with an official stamp. As the sun sets and you lie on a hard-packed floor, staring at a wooden ceiling above, your first day of bondage blurs. You've heard laughter, been barked at, nearly dropped a tray of wine, and figured out that nodding and silence are your safest tools. No one asked your name. You think of home, but the image slips through your fingers like oil. You're not quite sure what it means anymore. Only that you're not going back. Not today. Not soon. You close your eyes and breathe. Tomorrow, you'll learn your master's name. And your new one. You open your eyes to the sound of voices again, different this time. Less frantic. More transactional. You're standing now in the open-air slave market of Athens. Somewhere near the agora. The sun is already high, baking the pale stones underfoot. You shift from one sore foot to the other, trying not to draw attention, though every inch of you is designed to be seen. That's the cruel joke your value lies in how you're looked at. You glance around and see rows of other bodies, all equally still. Some are older, stooped and quiet, others younger, trembling. A few are children sitting in silence, faces blank as parchment. You are now an object among objects, arranged neatly for evaluation. You're back on display, but now with a price tag. The Athenian slave market isn't a hidden thing. It's public. Normal? Just another day's shopping, right next to stalls selling olive oil, figs, and ceramic trinkets. You hear a man discussing the merits of a plow while 2 stalls over, another man debates whether a certain Thracian girl would make a better seamstress or a better companion. The line between tools and people has never been thinner. Some of the wealthier citizens have a taste for specialty slaves. Scribes, musicians, foreign language tutors, or even cooks trained in the delicate art of spicing lentils just enough to impress dinner guests. Those fetch higher prices. You, though you're young, healthy, strong, that means one thing: labor, manual labor. Congratulations. A slave trader calls out bids with the casual rhythm of someone auctioning goats. Your arms are prodded again. He lifts your chin, opens your mouth, makes a vague gesture to your legs. You feel his breath on your face and fight the urge to turn away. You can't afford that kind of mistake. Historians still argue whether these markets were formalized with registries or run loosely like flea markets. The truth likely depends on the city. In Athens, it's organized but not overly bureaucratic. Paperwork is light. Human bodies move fast. Coins jingle. And choices are made in seconds that will shape years. You're not allowed to speak. That's part of the ritual. Buyers want to believe they're choosing based on strength or temperament, but really, they're choosing based on silence, on the idea that this person will obey. You nod at the right moments. That's all you can do. A few men nearby are stripped naked for inspection. You're spared that for now, but you don't relax. A woman is handed a veil and told she'll be serving wine tonight, not walking vineyards. She doesn't ask questions. She just nods. You watch a boy, maybe 11, being sold to a merchant who explains he needs someone small enough to crawl under benches. The boy blinks. His hand is already in the merchant's grasp. It's done. That fast? One strange fact floats into your mind from the overheard chatter in some markets. Slaves were made to declare their faults aloud, like I sleepwalk, or I talk too much, to protect buyers from bad surprises. In other places, that was considered unnecessary. Here in Athens, you're just expected to look healthy and quiet. Anything else they'll discover later. A wealthy man approaches you. He's older, with rings on his fingers and a beard shaped like an afterthought. He's not looking at you like a person, more like a solution to a problem he hasn't decided on yet. He doesn't speak to you directly. He just nods to the trader. The trader nods back. You're sold. Again. This man is named Cleon. You'll learn. He owns a small estate outside the city. Grapes? Maybe. Olives? Definitely. You follow him in silence as he pays, receives your simple linen tunic, and hands you a small satchel, your only possession now. Inside is a crust of bread, a strip of dried fish, and a long afternoon of walking ahead. You leave the market. No goodbyes? No acknowledgement from anyone still waiting behind? You're not supposed to look back, but you do. Just once. They're still standing there. Still waiting. Still priced. And just like that, your life as property begins in earnest. The market disappears behind a cloud of dust. The city fades into shimmering heat lines. And ahead of you, there's nothing but fields, commands, and a life no longer your own. The estate isn't as large as you expected. Just a modest farmhouse with olive trees stretching in every direction like patient, twisting sentinels. The sun is lower now, and the light is golden and lazy, slipping across the ground in wide, forgiving stripes. You're not sure if it feels peaceful or like a trap wrapped in scenery. You step into the household courtyard, packed earth, a well, and a small shrine to Hestia nestled near the kitchen door. A few other slaves glance up, then return to their work. No greetings, no nods. You're the new one, and they've seen new ones come and go. Your new role, domestic slave. Lucky, some would say. You're not in the mines, and you're not tethered to a plow under the summer sun. But as you'll quickly learn, house slaves are expected to vanish in plain sight. Always available. Never present. Cleon's wife appears before you've settled. She's younger than her husband, dressed in pale folds of linen that somehow stay spotless. She doesn't introduce herself. She looks you over with a level of disinterest typically reserved for wine jars and leaking roofs. You'll serve inside. She says, cleaning, sewing, waiting at the table. We'll see what else you're good for. You nod. That's all you can do. You're shown to a small corner of the kitchen where you'll sleep if there's time for sleep. The floor is hard. The air smells of oil and onion, and a rat skitters under the shelf like it owns the place. You stare at it. It stares back. Neither of you blinks. And then it vanishes. Your first task: sweep, then wash, then prepare the table. You've never handled so many amphorae in your life. Olive oil is heavier than it looks. So is wine. And pottery, as it turns out, does not bounce. You meet another slave, Thano, who's been here for years. He says as little as possible, but he shows you how to scrub the floors with crushed herbs to hide the smell of dogs. He also shows you where to stand during dinner just behind Cleon, always with your hands folded, unless you're refilling a cup or clearing a plate. You learn fast. You have to. The rhythm of domestic slavery is strange. You're busiest at dawn and dusk. Mornings mean fire starting, bread baking, and fetching water. Evenings mean lamps lit, sandals cleaned, children bathed. The hours between are filled with waiting, not idleness, but a poised stillness. You are a shadow, a whisper, a task waiting to be assigned. One fringe curiosity: some domestic slaves in Athens were trained to eavesdrop. Not for gossip, but to report back to the master if anyone said anything. Politically unwise. You don't know if that happens here, but Cleon is a nervous man, always glancing toward the gates. You pretend not to notice. You're told that slaves are sometimes punished with silence, not with beatings, but with being ignored, spoken around, or made invisible in a house where they already technically don't exist. And it works. You'd almost prefer the yelling. You also learn that not all slaves live the same life, even in the same household. The wet nurse, an older woman named Helot, is given a separate space and treated with a curious blend of affection and dismissal. The children cling to her. The mistress orders her. She walks that line with the grace of someone who's done it for years. Historians still debate whether domestic slaves were better off than field or mine slaves. Some say yes, less physical labor, more stability. Others argue that the proximity to power meant a constant, bone-deep awareness of one's own insignificance. You're close enough to watch the feast, but never to taste it. You also find out that you are expected to be polite at all times. Smiling is encouraged. Speaking is not. One wrong tone, one accidental eye roll, and you're scrubbing latrines for a week. Or worse. You hear whispers about a boy who spilled wine once and was sent to the quarry. No one mentions him anymore. Still, there are small mercies. You learn to appreciate the heat of the kitchen fire on cold mornings. You find ways to nap with your eyes open. You perfect the art of walking silently across gravel. And sometimes, when the house is empty and the others are gone to the city, you sing under your breath just a note or two, just enough to remind yourself you still can. At night, lying on your back beneath a kitchen shelf, the stars invisible behind terracotta and roof beams, you breathe deep. You're not free, but you're alive. And for now, that's the start of something. You wake before the roosters. That's not a metaphor, they actually crow late. At least compared to the creak of the door you're expected to open an hour before dawn. There's a bucket to fill, bread to knead, and ash to sweep. The house is still sleeping. But you don't get to. Today, though, you're not staying indoors. Cleon has other plans. You're being sent out to the fields his olive grove needs tending, and the workers there are short-handed. You swallow your complaints with your breakfast, which, if you're wondering, is yesterday's crust rubbed with a garlic clove and dipped in leftover wine? You pretend it's delicious. It isn't. You trudge along the path that winds out of the city, past fig trees and chirping cicadas, toward the farmstead that sprawls like a lazy octopus across the hills. Other slaves are already there, tired, tanned, and silent. One nods at you without smiling. That's friendliness. Field edition. Field. You're handed a woven basket and pointed toward a long row of gnarled trees. Your task: gather the olives that have fallen, check for rot, and sort them. It sounds simple, but your back will disagree with you by the third tree. The sun hasn't fully risen, and your knees already hate your face. Unlike the house, where at least there's a wall between you and the heat, field slaves face everything directly: sun, dirt, insects, and long hours with little break. You envy the birds, even the ones that poop on your tunic. And then, just when you think it can't get worse, someone mentions the mine. See, if this is tough, the silver mines at Lorien are a different level of horror entirely. That's where slaves go when their owners either really need money or really don't like them. You imagine the narrow shafts, the blackened hands, the air too thick to breathe properly. Some mine slaves never see the sky again. Children were often sent into the tightest crevices, crawling like beetles with picks and pails. You've never been more grateful for olives. Historians still argue over the death rate in those mines. Some say it was astronomical. Others say that's exaggerated. Either way, it wasn't great. The mines were profitable for the city, though silver paid for ships, armies, and the occasional marble temple to a god who did not, notably, dig silver himself. Back in the grove, you work until your shoulders scream. There's a rhythm to it. Shake, sort, drop, repeat. You learn to recognize the sound of a ripe olive hitting the basket just right. Small victories. During your midday rest, you sit with another worker named Macros. He doesn't talk much, but he gives you a few olives from his pocket, salted, preserved, actual flavor. You eat like it's a festival. Then he tells you about a man he knew who escaped once. Made it to the coast, he says. They caught him at a wine shop, drinking like a fool. You both shake your heads, not in pity, in disbelief. Who drinks in public when they're running? And yes, runaways happened. Some tried their luck. Some succeeded. Many didn't. Athens had a whole system for tracking down escaped slaves, sometimes with public announcements, sometimes by hiring freelance thugs. There were even slave catchers who made a living off of human homing. You finish your day sunburnt and sore, smelling like olives, sweat, and dirt. You kind of hate it, but also, you didn't spill wine or break a plate. And that, in your current career track, qualifies as a good day. As the sun slips behind the hills, you help load baskets into a cart. The driver grunts. You climb in beside him, and the two of you rattle back toward the city in silence, letting the dusk settle around you like a dusty blanket. You're not sure which is better, domestic service or field work. It's like asking whether it's nicer to drown or be buried alive. Both have their charms. When you reach the house again, the kitchen is already lit. You eat quickly stew this time, with a turnip chunk big enough to chew. Luxury. You're too tired to savor it, but you whisper a thanks to no one in particular. You lie down on the same rough floor as before. The room smells like onions and oil again, but it's familiar now. Your muscles ache, but they're the kind of aches that let you sleep. Just before you drift off, you remember something Macro said as you left the grove. The trees don't judge. They don't care if you're free or not. They just grow. And in that moment, you wish you were an olive tree, or a bird, or literally anything other than what you are. But you're here, still breathing, still owned, still dreaming of someday not being either. The clink of a chisel wakes you this time. Not from a mine or a chain, thankfully, but from the rhythmic tapping echoing through a narrow alley that smells of iron, soot, and sweat. You've been reassigned, at least for now, to a craftsman's workshop in Athens. You're not sure if it's punishment or just another whim of Cleon's. Either way, your new world is full of smoke, broken fingernails, and the steady, endless thud of hands shaping things that don't feel like yours. Your master's friend, a potter named Irenaeus, needs help, which means you need to help. Apparently, Cleon owed him a favor, and like everything in this world, favors are paid in labor. You get no vote. You step into the workshop cautiously, eyes adjusting to the dim light. It's chaotic but strangely beautiful shelves, stacked with amphorae in every stage of life. From raw clay cylinders to glazed masterpieces covered in dancing figures and war scenes, you almost bump into a spinning wheel, someone hisses. And you back off. Welcome to the world of enslaved artisans. Your first job. Turning clay. Not shaping it that's too skilled for a newcomer like you. Just wetting, softening, prepping. Clay dust clings to your throat like regret. You're handed a foot-powered wheel and shown how to keep it moving. Your calves start burning after 5 minutes. You start praying for numbness after 10. A man named Philostratos works beside you, another slave. He's been here for years. You watch his hands mold the pot with hypnotic grace. He talks while he works, explaining that he once belonged to a different artisan, but was traded when he grew too clever. Better to keep us dull, he says with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. Some Greek workshops trained their slaves so well, they became masters in all but name. A few even earned money for their owners, producing signature work that fetched high prices. Historians still debate whether some of the most famous pottery, yes, the ones with museum labels, were actually made by slaves. If so, their names were erased, of course. Can't have too many people getting ideas. As the day unfolds, you realize the work here is more technical, more focused. It doesn't demand as much brute strength as the fields, but it also leaves less room to hide. Every mistake shows. A pot cracked in the kiln is a ruined product. A glaze applied too thick is a wasted afternoon. You learn fast because you have to. Break something here, and it won't be just your pride that suffers. In the back of the workshop, there's a forge, and beyond that, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. You're told not to go near unless summoned. Metal is dangerous. So are the men who work it. You peek in anyway. The blacksmith doesn't look up, but you see the molten edge of a horseshoe being shaped like it's dough. You smell sweat and smoke and singed hair. Fun fact, some state-owned slaves were trained as coin makers, yes. People who struck currency, one disc at a time. That meant working with precious metals under strict surveillance. You imagine the weight of that responsibility. And the temptation. Some slaves were rumored to file off slivers of silver, little by little. If caught, let's just say they didn't get reassigned to pottery. You return to the clay. Hours pass. Your back cramps. The wheel sticks. Philostratus hums something off-key while he shapes another amphora. You're finally allowed to help carry pots to the kiln, a domed oven that radiates heat like a jealous god. You stack the vessels carefully, as instructed. Don't jostle them. Don't breathe too hard. If one breaks, they all crack. And then you'll wish you'd been sent to the mines instead. The potter mutters something about good slaves being like good handles, invisible unless broken. You pretend to laugh. Sort of. At midday, you're allowed to rest. You sit in the alley, sipping water from a shared jug. Your hands are gray with dust and your tunic is stiff with dried clay. But there's something almost meditative about the repetition. The predictability. It's still slavery, sure, but it has rhythm. Sure, and maybe you could get good at it. Later that week, the potter calls you over and points at a lump of clay. Try shaping it, he says. Your hands tremble, but you obey. The form is lopsided, uneven, embarrassing, but he doesn't shout. He just gestures for you to do it again. And again. You're not sure if he's being kind or calculating, but either way, you're learning. One night, you stay late with Philostratus. He shows you how to etch tiny details into a nearly dried pot scenes of gods and monsters and men with beards so detailed, you wonder if he knew one personally. You ask if he ever signs them. He laughs. Only in my head. He says somewhere, there's a crater being toasted at a feast. It has my soul in it, but my name lost. You lie awake that night thinking of your own hands, what they've shaped, what they've destroyed, what they might still build. You're still owned, but your fingers are learning something, and maybe that's a kind of quiet rebellion. The sky today is soft, overcast, and strangely kind, a thin layer of clouds diffusing the sun into a lazy silver glow. You're walking back toward the city center, trailing behind a young aristocrat who doesn't know your name but expects you to remember his every whim. His sandals click with a rhythm that sounds like boredom. You, however, are thinking about verbs and sentence structures and whether or not your accent has improved. Because this time, you're not just serving food or shaping clay. This time, you're teaching. It started a few weeks ago when Cleon's neighbor visited for dinner and brought along his newest acquisition, a well-dressed slave who spoke 2 languages and quoted Homer from memory. Cleon, never one to be outdone, decided you looked smart enough to polish. "You'll learn," he said, "or at least look clever enough while pretending." So here you are, an enslaved pedagogue, walking beside a boy named Damon, who recites his Greek lines with the flair of someone who knows no one will correct him. He's 11, moody, and entirely uninterested in the finer points of ethics. You, on the other hand, are required to care, because you are now part tutor, part babysitter, and part scapegoat. If he fails to learn your fault, if he succeeds his natural genius, obviously, you sit with him in a shady portico, under painted beams that depict gods whose favor you are unlikely to earn. Damon struggles with a passage from Hesiod. You gently suggest he rephrase the sentence. He rolls his eyes. You correct him again. He shrugs and throws a fig at you. It misses. You smile because smiling is safer than sighing. There's a quiet irony in your position. In ancient Greece, slaves were often considered unthinking property, yet the educated slaves were expected to teach thinking to their masters' children. Historians still debate whether this was seen as practical hypocrisy or just a natural extension of the system. Either way, it creates a bizarre hierarchy. You are smarter, but still owned, wiser, but still whipped if needed. One fringe detail that always sticks with you. Some wealthy families employed slaves who had once been free philosophers, captured or indebted, now reduced to instructing spoiled sons about the virtue of freedom. There's a special kind of sting in that. When Damon finishes his lesson for the day, meaning he's bored and wants to go home, you pack up the scrolls and follow him back toward the household. Along the way, he tries to impress a girl by quoting something you taught him. He butchers the line, but she laughs anyway. You say nothing. Later, back at the house, Cleon gives you an approving nod. He's improving. He mutters, tossing you a piece of barley bread as if that's a promotion. You take it with a bow. Evenings are quiet now. Your new role gives you fewer chores but demands more alertness. You spend time reviewing scrolls borrowed from Cleon's dusty collection Homer, Pindar, bits of Plato. You're allowed to read, but not to write anything of your own. You dream of writing anyway. Just a few lines. A poem. Maybe. A memory. A joke. Something to remind yourself that you once belonged to yourself. Another educated slave, Lysanias, visits one day. He serves a neighboring household, teaching music and composition. You speak with him in coded tones while the boys spar with wooden swords nearby. He tells you he once studied at a temple school, free and ambitious. Then came a raid, a ship, a chain. Now he tunes lyres and translates speeches he'll never give. You wonder if you'll ever be free. Manumission is possible. Rare, but possible. Cleon might grant it someday. Or not. It depends on so many things: his mood, his finances, your usefulness. Some educated slaves bought their own freedom over time, saving wages or bartering favors. But the road is long, and the price is high. You remind yourself that knowledge, at least, is something no one can fully take. Not even Cleon. Not even the system. The verses you've memorized, the lines you correct, the truths you quietly carry, these are your hidden garden. Invisible, but rooted deep. One day, while Damon is away, you're asked to tutor a visiting girl named Anthea. She's curious, quick, and unusually polite. She thanks you when you explain the difference between dative and genitive. She asks you about your home, and you almost answer honestly. Almost. She tells you she wants to be a poet. You smile because you once did too. That night, you lie in your corner of the kitchen, whispering lines from Sappho to yourself, carefully rearranging the words into your own rhythm. No one hears, but you do. You are still a slave, but also something else. A reader, a guide, a keeper of things others think you've forgotten. And that's worth remembering. The air feels different today. Cooler, stiffer, tinged with a scent that isn't olive or ash. It smells like marble dust and old parchment. You're walking through the heart of Athens, but not as a house slave, field laborer, or tutor. Today, your steps echo down stone corridors and past long columns. You're now a public slave, owned not by Cleon or any private citizen, but by the Athenian state itself. This changes your duties, but not your freedom. You've been assigned to the Bouleuterion, the council house, where 500 Athenian citizens meet to plan, argue, and shout about everything from grain imports to naval strategy. Your job, mostly standing around, occasionally delivering scrolls, frequently holding your tongue while men who can't remember your name decide the fate of people who look just like you. You're not alone. The demozioi, or public slaves, form an entire class of their own. You pass others in tunics just like your scribes, clerks, assistants to magistrates, even secretaries in charge of the civic archives. One man you nod to is responsible for maintaining a list of all new citizens. He doesn't look impressed with the work or the citizens. And yes, irony abounds. Here, in the birthplace of democracy, enslaved people help run the democracy. You process paperwork you'll never benefit from. You tally votes you're not allowed to cast. You deliver decrees you didn't write, can't question, and must recite aloud like a well-trained liar. Historians still argue how much autonomy public slaves really had. Some say they earned wages. Others say their pay went straight to the treasury. Some rose to positions of genuine influence, quiet influence, tucked behind titles and duties that carried weight but never authority. Take the Scythian archers, for instance, yes. Public slaves dressed as foreign warriors, used as a kind of rudimentary police force. You spot one now, leaning on a spear by the stoa of Attalos. His tunic bears a stitched-on bow, and he's watching a rowdy group of citizens with mild disdain. His job? Crowd control? Arrests? Chasing thieves? But only if they aren't citizens. If they are, well, he's expected to ask politely. You hear a whispered story about one Scythian archer who accidentally hit a drunken council member during a brawl. He disappeared the next day. No one ever found out what happened. Or maybe everyone did. They just stopped saying it out loud. Your own work takes you into the archives today. You're tasked with organizing property records rolls of papyrus that curl like sleepy snakes in clay jars. You scan each name carefully, not because you care who owns what, but because if you misplace one, you're the one punished. Not the jar, not the scroll. Still, you find moments of odd wonder. A tax register from 2 decades ago, signed in the shaky script of a man who's now likely dead. A list of temple offerings olives, honey, wool, and yes, one tunic cleaned by a Thracian slave. Probably someone like you. You step outside for air and end up near the Areopagus, where trials are held under the open sky. Another public slave ushers defendants into place, You nod to each other. He tells you he once recorded testimonies for murder trials. People say anything when they're scared. He says, accept the truth. You return to the council chambers just in time for a heated debate about naval funding. You stand at attention, holding a tray of wax tablets. The men argue loudly, occasionally glancing toward you as if you might suddenly sprout opinions. You don't nod out loud. Later, you're called to deliver a message to a man in the assembly. He frowns at your presence and waves you off with a flick of his fingers. You pause, wait, then leave, carrying the unspoken weight of being present but unwelcome. Visible and invisible at the same time? Here's a strange thought. Public slaves were sometimes more educated than the citizens they served. It happened. A lifetime of transcribing documents and listening to debates can make you smarter quietly. Dangerously smarter. But smart doesn't equal free. And yet, some say public slaves had it better than most. No fields, no mines, no beatings unless you really messed up. You walk through a covered portico as the sun begins to dip, and you wonder if this maybe is the best-case scenario? A life of silent bureaucracy, measured speech, and no pickaxes. You return to your quarters small, shared, and tucked behind a council building. You lie on a wooden pallet with a blanket that's seen too many winters. But your hands are clean, your knees unbruised, and no one yelled at you today. That counts for something. You whisper a line from the decree you copied earlier. Let the city flourish by the rule of law. You say it again, just for yourself. Because even in chains, language can still feel like freedom. You're far from Athens now, far from the chatter of merchants, the marble courts, and the smoke curling out of polite kitchens. The hills here are rough, scarred with stones, and the wind feels harder, less interested in being gentle. You've come to Sparta, and nothing here resembles anything you've known before. You are not a chattel slave anymore, not even a domestic servant. Here, you are a Helot, and that is something else entirely. The Spartans don't think of Helots as individuals. You are a category, a class, a conquered people permanently branded by defeat. You're not owned by a person, but by the state, a city built on blood, discipline, and the constant hum of impending violence. You don't wear chains. You don't live in a master's house, but make no mistake, you are not free. You were born into it. Most likely. Your ancestors came from Messenia, a fertile region west of Sparta, and when Sparta conquered the land generations ago, it didn't wipe out the people, it enslaved them all instead. Not individually, nationally. The entire population was made subordinate to the Spartan state, tasked with one thing, feeding it. Every year, you're expected to hand over a set amount of grain, olive oil, or livestock to your Spartan overlords. If you don't, well, no one writes you a polite letter. No one fines you. You're just punished. Or worse, ignored until something worse happens. The law doesn't protect you because the law wasn't written for you. And here's the twist, unlike slaves in Athens. You're allowed to have a family, keep a home, even engage in religious ceremonies. You can live in your own village, raise children, marry, but always with the knowledge that you are living on borrowed terms. The sword is never far from your neck. Far from every autumn, you face something most don't even believe is real until they live it, the cryptia. This state-sanctioned terror is carried out by elite young Spartan men, often teenagers who roam the countryside at night with knives. Their job, kill Helots. Silently. Randomly. As a reminder, not because a Helot has misbehaved, but because fear keeps you in line. The cryptia isn't an official war, but Sparta legally declares war on the Helots every year, yes. every year, so that killing you doesn't violate religious law. Historians still argue whether this ritual slaughter was symbolic or widespread. Some say it was exaggerated by later writers. Others suggest thousands were killed over time. But the Helots remember, and they remember in silence. You tend the fields by day. You stoop over wheat that will never be yours. You patch a thatched roof while watching Spartan boys practice their war dances. You nod respectfully to soldiers passing by, even the ones younger than you, especially them. And yes, you resist. Quietly. You oversalt a batch of fish. You claim a goat died of illness. You hide tools in the thatch. Sometimes, Helots rebel outright small uprisings, usually crushed before they begin. But once after a massive earthquake shook Sparta in the 460s BCE, Helots saw their chance. It was one of the largest Helot revolts in history. They took refuge on Mount Ithome and held off the Spartan army for 10 years. 10 years? It didn't work. Eventually, they surrendered. Some were allowed to leave. But the message lingered even in chains. People can bite back. One odd twist in the system, Sparta sometimes offered Helots freedom in exchange for military service. These freedmen were known as neodemodeus. But freedom didn't mean equality. It meant you might be able to walk down a Spartan street without being killed for sport. That was about it. You overhear two Spartans speaking one day. One says, "A good Helot is like a horse you feed it. Ride it. And never let it forget who holds the reins." You say nothing, but you remember it. Not out of obedience, out of rage. Or survival. Or maybe both. And here's a curious fact. Helots sometimes outnumbered Spartans 10-1. Think about that. The entire Spartan society was structured to suppress people who, if organized, could overwhelm them. That's why the Spartans trained so hard, lived so simply, feared luxury, because they knew without absolute control, the whole thing crumbles. At night, you lie in a small house lit by a shallow oil lamp. Your children sleep nearby. You listen to the rustle of wind through dry branches, always alert for a footstep that doesn't belong. You breathe shallowly. You dream of elsewhere. You are not a house slave, not a mine worker, not a public servant. You are something older, rougher, enslaved by a nation, not a man. And while your labor is tolerated, your spirit is not. But somewhere deep inside, deeper than the grain stores, deeper than the Spartan fear, there is a stubborn ember. It doesn't flicker. It waits. You wake to the sound of footsteps, but not the heavy, obvious kind. These are soft, subtle, and deliberate. Someone creeping. You keep still. Eyes closed, ears open. Not because you're in danger exactly, but because in the world you live in, resistance is never loud. It's cautious, clever, and nearly invisible. You're back in Athens now. The city doesn't smell like fear the way Sparta does, but it hums with quiet compliance. And somewhere inside that hum, there's always a thread of friction. Tonight, you follow it into the hidden life of slave resistance, the smallest rebellions, the softest blows. They call it quiet defiance. You've seen it. You've done it. Not grand revolts, but slow sabotage, mumbled insults, and strategic clumsiness. That amphora that broke, maybe it just slipped. Maybe that soup that was too salty. Maybe you forgot the measurement, or maybe your master needed a little humility today. Historians still argue whether this kind of resistance counts as real resistance. But ask any slave who lived it, and they'll tell you it's survival disguised as obedience. You remember a girl named Meto, small and sharp-tongued, who used to work in the weaving rooms. She once stitched a row of knots backward on a garment destined for a symposium. It was barely noticeable, but it drove her mistress wild. "The goddess is facing the wrong way," she shouted. "She's mocking me." Meto just shrugged. "My hands must have been tired." They were, but not too tired to be exact in their rebellion. You also recall Delon, a field worker who always walked just a little slower when carrying water, spilling just enough to have to go back. Not so much to be punished, but enough to drain his master's patience over time. He used to say, "If they count my steps, they'll have to pay for them one day." Of course, there were those who took bigger risks. You meet Korax, a stable hand rumored to have helped an escaped slave disappear. He won't admit it. He just smiles and says, "I know horses. Sometimes they bolt." But his master never found the runaway, and Korax was never quite trusted again. Then there's the Whisper Network. The backdoor gossip passed between house slaves during errands. News of revolts in Chios, rumors of a mass poisoning in Thebes, unverified tales of slaves who stole ships and sailed east, never to return. Some of it is probably nonsense, but in the absence of real hope, stories become resistance too. One tale that stuck with you, a cook who slowly replaced every spice in the kitchen with bitter herbs. No one noticed for weeks. Guests kept complimenting the earthiness of the food. He eventually confessed not to sabotage, but because he was tired of hearing false praise, he preferred honesty, even if it tasted like dirt. Another curious fact in some households, slaves developed coded gestures a touch to the elbow, a flick of the wrist, a blink held just too long, a secret language of warning and wit. You once watched a pair of cupbearers communicate an entire conversation without speaking a word. Their master remained oblivious, laughing into his wine. Some revolts did happen, though rarely. There's record of a slave uprising in 413 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, when the chaos of war allowed thousands of Athenian slaves to escape to the Spartan side. It terrified the ruling class, not because of the numbers, but because it showed that the unthinkable was, in fact, thinkable. You overheard Cleon mutter about it once after a tense assembly debate. "We coddle them too much," he said, sipping diluted wine. "One day, they'll believe they're more than what they are." You stood nearby, hands folded, eyes lowered. You smiled. Just a little. Sometimes the resistance wasn't even directed at the master. Sometimes it was spiritual. You knew a temple slave named Charis who offered prayers not to the Olympian gods, but to the household spirits of her homeland. She kept a small carved figure in her room, hidden in a crack behind the wall. "The gods here don't listen to me," she said, "but mine do." That, too, was resistance. There were also moments of resistance so quiet they almost felt like breathing, refusing to smile, holding a gaze too long, whispering your real name under your breath as you swept the floor, making a joke at the wrong moment, offering just enough effort to fulfill a task but never the extra inch they expected from the good ones. And of course, there were dreams. You dreamt of walking out the front gate without permission, of turning left instead of right, of stepping into a boat and never being called back. You never told anyone, but you woke with the feeling of wind in your hair and no one shouting your name. The truth is, most slaves didn't revolt. They endured. And enduring itself was a kind of rebellion, stubborn, steady, and deeply inconvenient for those who believed they had broken you. You lie awake tonight on a floor that isn't yours, wrapped in a blanket that smells like ash and thyme. The house is quiet, but in the dark, you whisper a joke you once made to yourself. "They think I serve because I must. I serve because I choose not to die." It's not funny, but it keeps you sane. You close your eyes and plot absolutely nothing. Except maybe one misplaced amphora tomorrow. Your name is gone. Not legally, there's no legal documentation for someone like you, but practically, you haven't heard your birth name in years? Maybe you whispered it once, into a clay bowl while washing linens. Maybe you etched its first letter into a wall, then rubbed it away before anyone could notice. Or maybe you've forgotten it completely. Now, you answer to whatever they call you. In Athens, slaves rarely keep their original names. Most are renamed by their masters, sometimes mockingly, sometimes randomly, and sometimes after Greek heroes you've never heard of. There's a farmhand named Achilles whose left foot drags from an old injury. A housemaid called Aspasia, though her tongue is nothing like the famed philosopher's mistress. Your Doros, apparently? It means gift. You try not to laugh. Naming you is part of the process. It's an erasure wrapped in familiarity. By renaming you, they claim you, mold you, shape your story so it fits their needs. And often, they don't stop at names. You've seen a girl renamed Nia Nu? Because her mistress liked the idea of starting fresh. Another slave was called Silentos because he never spoke unless spoken to. He died without ever hearing his real name again. You ask once quietly if you can choose your own name. Cleon snorts and says, "Slaves don't choose, they receive." Historians still argue whether the practice of renaming was purely practical or deeply psychological. After all, a new name makes it easier to forget the past. It makes a person more like property labeled, ordered, sorted. But among yourselves, in back kitchens and in alleys, you reclaim little bits. Nicknames sprout like weeds, playful, sly, sometimes brutal. A wiry boy called Fishbone, a girl with a loud laugh named Echo. You're Doros in the house, but among your fellow slaves. You're Greyfinger. After that day, you came in from the workshop with dust up to your elbows. One curious fact you pick up from a public scribe on some rare manumission documents. Freed slaves are allowed to choose a name, usually a Greek one. Sometimes combining their former owner's name with a fresh start, like Cleonides or Sophronikos. It's a strange kind of legacy. You walk free, but your old master lives on in your new identity. Freedom with a fingerprint. There are also inscriptions graffiti, really carved into walls in the darker corners of the agora. You spot one during errands, barely visible unless the light hits just right. It reads, Timon was never his name. It's written low, at eye level for someone sitting or kneeling. You pause there for a moment longer than you should. Some slaves invent secret names for themselves, names they whisper only once, at night under their breath, as if naming a future version of themselves they might never meet. You've done it too. You called yourself Thales once, just to see how it sounded. It doesn't fit, but it felt yours? Sometimes. Names are changed again and again. New household, new name. New task, new name. In one kitchen, 3 girls were all called Lydia, because their mistress didn't care enough to distinguish them. One Lydia's as good as another. She said, so they called each other Red, Tall, and Whistles. Their secret code? And then there are those rare cases, so rare they feel like myth of slaves whose names outlived them. One's remembered not for obedience, but for defiance. You once heard of Aeson, a slave who refused to put out a hearth fire and let the kitchen blaze. He was whipped, then sold, but his story stayed. Another, Mira, was known for slipping coins into the hands of beggars on her mistress's errands. She was dismissed, vanished. But the beggars remember. You walk the streets now with your head slightly down, but not too much. You've learned that a bowed head invites orders. An upright one invites suspicion. The trick is in the middle. The trick is knowing who you are even when no one else does. And yet, as the seasons pass, something strange happens. The name Doros begins to stick. You answer to it without thinking. You hear it in your dreams. It becomes part of your steps, your hands, your voice. Not because it's true, but because it's there. One night, by lamp glow, you press a dull stylus into a scrap of wax and write the name you haven't spoken aloud in years. Your real name. Just the first syllable. You stare at it for a long time, then you smooth it away with your thumb. Not because it hurts, because in a way, you've become more than one person. Doros is the one they see. The one who serves wine, sweeps floors, recites Hesiod. The other name, that one belongs to your memory, your story, your soul. And that they can never fully rename. You're carrying a basket of figs today, and it's heavier than it looks, just like the idea that freedom is waiting around the corner. Someone once said that if you work hard enough, are loyal enough, obedient enough, maybe one day you'll be free. But here's the part they whisper less often: even freedom can come with a leash. You're about to walk through the twisting, uncertain path of manumission, the process of being released from slavery in ancient Greece. Not promised, not easy, and definitely not always what it seems. Your master, Cleon, is in a generous mood today. Not toward you, of course, but toward his cousin, who recently freed a slave and earned a warm mention at a symposium. Cleon likes warm mentions, so he drops a line at dinner. Maybe I'll free Doros. One day. You keep your face still. Inside, your heart does a thing between laughing and crying. Manumission isn't like flipping a switch. There are rules, expectations, ceremonies. First, your master has to want to free you. That might happen because of loyalty, usefulness, or just sheer performative generosity. Sometimes it's a reward for years of service. Sometimes it's a public stunt. And sometimes it's a transaction. Yes, slaves can buy their own freedom if allowed. That means earning or saving enough money through tips, side work, or clever deals. Some call it peculium money, technically still owned by your master, but informally yours to manage. You've seen slaves hoard copper coins for years, hiding them in cracks in the floor, under loose tiles, behind shrines. You met a man once, Menno, who bought his freedom with the winnings from a chariot bet. He was a stable slave. He whispered the odds to a merchant, took a secret cut of the profits, and 3 years later, bought his own name back. Then he disappeared into the port crowd like morning mist. You still think about him. Other manumissions are done through public declarations. Your master might take you to a sanctuary like the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and make a formal statement that you are now free, sold symbolically to the god. It sounds noble. It's really just paperwork in marble. But there's a catch. Of course there is. Most freed slaves in Athens became medics resident foreigners. That means you're not a slave, but you're still not a citizen. You can't vote. You can't own land. You have to pay a special tax to keep living in the city. And if your former master wants, he can stay in your life as your guardian, with legal power over you in certain matters. So you're free, but you might still need permission to leave town, or marry, or sue someone. Some masters even included conditions in the manumission, like working for them part-time for the rest of your life, like freedom with office hours. Historians still debate whether manumission was a genuine act of social mobility or just a more polite form of control. Some freedmen thrived, opening shops, teaching, crafting, building a life. Others found themselves stuck in a gray zone, not owned, but not entirely accepted. You imagine it anyway. The day you walk through the market without glancing over your shoulder. The day your name is written not as property, but as person. The day you choose where you sleep. With whom? Why? You've heard stories of slaves faking freedom, buying or forging documents, wearing citizen-style clothes, bluffing their way through markets. It's dangerous, but it happens. Once a man was caught doing just that, pretending to be a medic. His punishment, re-enslavement. This time, no hope of manumission. There's another route, too. Rarer, stranger, adoption. A master could legally adopt a slave, making them a child in the eyes of the law. It happened. Not often. Usually for political reasons, or because the master had no heirs. But imagine that being called son one day after years of being called boy. You run the math in your head. Sometimes how many coins would it take? How many years could you ask Cleon? Would he laugh? Would he punish you for the question? One night, you speak with Helot, the older wet nurse. She tells you she was offered freedom once but turned it down. What would I do with it, she says. This house is cruel, but outside is expensive. At least here I have soup and a roof. You don't judge her, but you can't help wanting more. And so, you work. You keep your voice calm, your hands steady, your eyes a little lower than pride wants. You store small coins in a cloth pouch stitched inside your tunic, just in case. You whisper to the gods, not the ones in statues, but the ones in shadows. You ask them to make Cleon generous or distracted or ambitious. You ask them to make you lucky. You ask them to let you walk free before your back is too bent to enjoy it. And maybe, someday, someone will say your name, your real name, in a voice that isn't giving orders. They'll just be saying hello. You're sweeping the courtyard this morning when you hear the clang of bronze and the distant chant of a hymn. The scent of burning incense drifts over the wall. Sharp, sweet, almost dizzying. Somewhere nearby, a sacrifice is being offered. Probably a goat. Possibly a chicken. Definitely not for your benefit. Because today, you're being reminded that even the gods have a hierarchy, and you're standing at the bottom of it. Slavery in ancient Greece wasn't just an economic condition, it was baked into their cosmic worldview. And yes, even religion played along. You serve your master, but you're also expected to serve the gods just with less ceremony and fewer laurel wreaths. There are religious festivals you can't fully join, processions you can't lead, temples you can't enter. But when it comes to preparing the offerings, sweeping the altars, or cleaning up after the feast, that's where you come in. You once helped carry a roasted ox to a sanctuary for Poseidon. You weren't allowed to approach the altar directly, of course, but you carried its legs with care, smoke stinging your eyes. The priest didn't even glance at you. You were the muscle, the mule. Really, the gods got the fat. The citizens got the meat. You got a cold barley cake at the end and a sore shoulder. And here's a strange contradiction in many religious rituals. Slaves were required to be present, even necessary. You might be asked to accompany a young boy as he leads a lamb to sacrifice. You might hold the bowl of water for purification. You might stand behind the priest, unseen, waiting to remove the bones. But you're excluded from most of the spiritual benefits. You're there to work, not to worship. One scholar once described it as serving the divine but never dining with it. Sounds about right. You remember the Panathenaic festival, the great celebration of Athena, with torches, races, music, and miles of white cloth offered to the goddess. You watched it once from a distance, holding the reins of a team of oxen. They say all of Athens rejoices. You remember only the dust and the smell of manure. Some slaves were attached directly to temples. They were called hierodoloi, sacred slaves. In theory, it sounds more glamorous. You imagine marble columns, sacred tasks, and holy reverence. In practice, you hear, it meant long hours polishing statues and holding heavy trays of incense. One such temple slave once told you, "The gods smell better, but they demand just as much." Still, temple slaves had a strange dual status. They were considered holy property, which sometimes offered them protection. Harming a sacred slave could result in a fine or worse. But this holiness didn't make them free. If anything, it made them harder to buy out. One curious thing, certain sanctuaries became asylum zones, where runaway slaves might seek refuge. Temples of gods like Apollo or Demeter were known for offering protection, at least temporarily. If a slave made it there and clasped the altar, it was seen as a sacred appeal. Masters were sometimes forced to negotiate, or even set them free. Sometimes. Other times, they just dragged them out by force and dared the gods to object. Historians still debate how often this temple asylum actually worked. Some say it was symbolic, a last-ditch effort. Others think it had legal weight. Either way, it was risky. You only ran to the gods when you had nowhere else to go. You once knew a girl named Syra, who claimed to have hidden in the temple of Artemis for 3 days before being discovered. She said the priestess gave her bread and told her to pray faster. Then she was sent back. No one punished the priestess. Syra walked with a limp after that. And still, religion was woven into your life, whether you wanted it or not. You were expected to participate in household rituals, pour libations, say blessings, sweep the hearth. You bowed your head during eclipses, murmured protection prayers when children were born, helped carry funeral jars. You did it all with quiet precision, never quite sure if the gods were listening, or if they cared. Sometimes, late at night, you made your own offerings, not to Athena or Apollo, but to your ancestors. You whispered names no one here could pronounce. You drew symbols in dust behind the shed. Once, you left a sliver of meat beside a cracked tile and said, "For whoever remembers me." It wasn't official, but it was real. And perhaps that's the only worship that ever matters. There's one more wrinkle in this divine imbalance. Some slaves became oracles. Rare? Yes, but it happened. A few were thought to be touched by the gods' dreamers, visionaries, women who muttered riddles in caves. One was said to speak with the voice of Apollo himself. She was never freed, but her words were carved in stone. You often wondered what it would take for someone to believe you spoke for the gods. Probably nothing less than fire raining from the sky. Still, you speak sometimes to the wind, to the moon, to the gods who maybe don't care. You say, "I served the feast. I cleaned the blood. I carried your offerings." Was it enough? No answer. But the stars seemed to blink once, like a shrug. You'll take it. You fold a tunic freshly laundered, the linen cool against your fingers, and glance toward the doorway where your mistress is calling. Her voice is sharp, layered with expectations and boredom. You rise quickly and follow her down the corridor. She doesn't look at you. Why would she? You're part of the furniture. You're the enslaved woman in the household, and that means your world is twice as narrow and 3 times as heavy. Being a slave is hard. Being a female slave, that's a different level of invisible. You share your sleeping space with 3 others, Tisbe, Clea, and Anthus, each of you shouldering not just the burden of labor, but the constant tension of being watched, touched, and used at will. Domestic slaves are everywhere in an Athenian home, milling grain, heating water, dressing children, spinning wool. But the women do all this while under the unspoken threat of being treated not just as property, but as flesh. No one says it aloud. They don't have to. It's written into the architecture. The women's quarters, or gymnasium, is your world. You wake there, work there, eat there, and rarely leave. But unlike the wives and daughters of the house, you don't get rest or respect. You're the one who gets up first and sleeps last. The one who bathes the baby and is blamed when it cries? You watch your mistress comb her hair in front of a polished bronze mirror. She sighs and tells you you'll be accompanying her today to the baths. Not for your own comfort. You'll carry her oils, her robe, her sandals. You're not invited into the waters, just the shadows. As you wrap her cloak around her shoulders, you notice the bruises on her forearms soft, fading marks like purple petals. You don't ask. She won't tell you anyway. She, too, is limited. But you're chained beneath her chains. Historians still debate how deeply the lives of enslaved women differed from enslaved men. But here's what's known. Women were often confined to the domestic sphere, making them more vulnerable to sexual exploitation, forced intimacy, and generational slavery bearing children who would also be enslaved. You think of Praxilla, a young girl barely 15, already tending her mistress's infant. Her job is to suckle the baby when her mistress rests. No one asked her. No one thanked her. Her own milk, her own body. Her own motherhood used, then dismissed. The baby will grow and forget her. Her own child, taken away. No names kept. There's no official count of how many enslaved women bore children for their masters either through coercion or arrangement. But you know the numbers are there. They live in the bodies around you. In the silence after dinner. In the way some children avoid looking their nurse in the eyes. And if the mistress grows jealous, suspicious, or bored, you're reassigned. Or worse, the women of the house can wield cruelty like a needle quick. Sharp. Precise. An insult here. A slap there. A punishment over folded towels or burnt incense. You saw it happen to Claire last week. The baby bit her while feeding, and the mistress snapped, said she was cursed, slapped her so hard she bled, then ordered her to sweep the ashes from the hearth she wasn't allowed to touch without permission. Yet somehow, there are still moments of sisterhood, not between you and your mistress, but between the women beneath her roof. You and Tisbe share stories at night, half-remembered tales from your grandmothers, whispered in the dark while feet ache and backs throb. Anthis sings sometimes softly, tunelessly, but beautifully. You all close your eyes when she does. You imagine a different life. One where you choose your own dress. One where your body is your own. One where you get to leave a room without being summoned. Some female slaves work in brothels. 2 porna, owned by pimps who rent them out by the hour. You've never been there, but you've heard the stories. Some girls escape that life and end up in households like yours. Some are never seen again. One visitor once bragged that he paid extra to have a girl dress like Artemis before worship. You and Clea exchanged a look across the courtyard. And some enslaved women, believe it or not, rise in rank. There's the rare oikonomos, a housekeeper slave who manages the domestic space with almost matronly authority. She runs the books, supervises others, makes sure the wine is sweet, the laundry crisp, and the guests content. She has power but no freedom. You knew one once. Her name was Melina. She spoke 5 languages and controlled a house of 30. Her mistress still called her that woman. And yes, female slaves could be freed, just like men. But once free, they faced even more limitations. No citizenship, no land, often no husband unless a former master claimed them as a concubine or companion. One strange case you remember hearing: a freedwoman in Corinth opened a tavern and was fined for disrupting civic morals. Her crime: independence. Tonight, you wash your hands in the same basin your mistress used hours earlier. You dry them on the towel she threw at you. You lie down next to Anthus, who's already snoring softly, face turned to the wall. You whisper your own name, your real one, into the blanket. Then you whisper it again. You tell yourself you won't forget it, because no matter how many rooms you're told to enter or bodies you're forced to serve, you still belong to yourself, somewhere deep inside, untouched by law or ritual or hands. And that part of you, she's still awake. You stand before a mirror, not a polished bronze disc like your mistress uses, but a basin filled with still water, catching just enough morning light to show you the outline of your own face. Not for vanity, for inspection. Because today, your body isn't just a tool, it's the currency, the catalog, and sometimes the message. In ancient Greece, a slave's body isn't something they own. It's something others display. You felt this truth in 100 small ways when your calloused hands are noticed, when your muscles are examined, when a guest remarks on your posture as though you're a horse up for auction. You are looked at, measured, and judged not by who you are, but how your body can serve. Domestic slaves are expected to appear clean and orderly, without drawing attention. You learn to walk softly, hold your arms close, avoid direct eye contact unless summoned. Your tunic must not wrinkle. Your hair must not smell. There's no reward for this perfection, only punishment when it slips. In public, slaves often wear simple clothing that marks them as property. Not rags, no. That would reflect poorly on the master, but never fine linen either. You're meant to look presentable but unremarkable, like a background prop in the theater of upper-class life. One curious fact: there was no universal dress code for slaves in Greece. Some could blend in. Others were marked more obviously. In some cities, slaves who ran errands wore dog tags, metal discs hung around the neck, inscribed with the name of the owner and a return address. Like an expensive lost item. You saw one once. The inscription read, "Return to Demetrios, potter, if taken or found," as if the person wearing it didn't already know where they'd be returned. But the most visceral reminder of your body's status comes in the form of branding and scars. Some slaves are marked with tattoos, usually on the forehead or arms, etched with short phrases like fugitive, thief, or I belong to so-and-so. It's rare in Athens, more common in places like Byzantium or Chios, but the fear lingers everywhere. You've seen a man branded on the cheek with a curling letter. You remember how he avoided firelight after that, as if the mark might speak again. He never said what it meant. Then there are the tools of control. You've seen leg irons, neck shackles, and thumb screws not always used, but always kept in view, like polite threats sitting on a shelf. In some households, slaves were trained with gentle correction. In others, correction meant bruises that lasted for weeks. Historians still debate whether slaves were regularly beaten, or if violence was reserved for dramatic offenses. But you know that discipline doesn't have to be physical to be etched into the body. Sometimes it's in how you flinch when someone raises their voice, or how your hands tremble at the sight of a spilled wine jug. And then there's display. Some slaves, especially those with particular skills or appearance, are paraded like prizes. You once knew a boy named Lycos, tall and handsome, who was kept near the front courtyard during dinner parties. He poured wine like a statue. The guests always noticed him. So did the mistress. Eventually, he was sent away to a cousin's estate. He came back quieter. He looked at the floor more often. You think of your own body, what it's endured, what it's concealed, the scar on your shin from when you dropped a pot, the callus on your thumb from hours at the loom, the knot in your shoulder that never quite fades. But you also think of the small ways you reclaim it. When you wash in the courtyard basin and take an extra moment to enjoy the cool water on your skin, when you stand straighter than necessary, not for them, but for you, when you learn to breathe slowly, deeply, in moments of stress just to remind your body it still belongs to itself, at least for now. You remember a woman named Phila who rubbed thyme oil into her hair every night. Not because she had to, but because it made her feel like someone who chose things, even if it was just scent. And you recall a fleeting touch a fellow slave named Timon, brushing your arm as he passed by. No words. Just a reminder that you are still seen, not as a tool, but as a person, even if only for a second. Tonight, you lie on your pallet, muscles aching, arms sore from carrying amphory. You stretch, just a little, and feel the small, satisfying crack in your spine. You smile in the dark. You may not own your body, but it still carries your story. In every step, in every bruise, in every breath. And no master can rewrite that. You're holding a child's hand today small, sticky, and curled with unspoken trust. He's not your child, of course. He's your master's nephew. His mother is sick, or away, or just tired of listening to his questions. So they gave him to you, with a wave of the hand and the vague instruction. Keep him quiet. You carry him to the courtyard, tell him stories, and wipe his nose with the edge of your tunic. He clings to you like a vine. You know better than to cling back. This is your quiet introduction to the life of enslaved children. Not just the ones you care for, but the ones who are slaves themselves. Born into a world where childhood is not a season, but a sentence. You've seen them in every corner of Athens' little hands turning millstones, small feet racing errands between workshops, eyes too wide and too quiet. Some are born in the household, the children of enslaved mothers like Clea, who gave birth last spring with no midwife, just hushed whispers and old cloths. The child was taken away by noon. Too many mouths, the mistress said. Other children arrive as part of dowries or inheritances, passed from one estate to another like cattle with smaller shoes. A boy named Theron, barely 8, once told you his last home had better figs. That's all he remembers. Figs. You think of your own childhood or try to... It blurs now. Was there a field? A river, someone who hummed while cooking? You remember the feeling of running barefoot. That's all. The rest has been worn smooth by years of obedience. The smallest slaves often start with simple tasks carrying firewood, fetching water, picking herbs. But even then, there's no margin for error. A dropped pot earns the same slap, no matter your age. One time, you saw a girl punished for stealing a fig she couldn't possibly have carried. She just stood near it too long. That was enough. Historians still argue whether slave children were treated more leniently than adults. The answer, you suspect, depends on the house, the master, and the day. Some children were coddled until they could hold a broom. Others were scolded into silence by 3. One cruel quirk. In some households, slave children were raised alongside the master's own kids, sharing toys and rooms until the day they were old enough to understand their place. You knew a boy called Melon who played every day with his young master until they turned 13. Then one day, Melon was told to carry his friend's sandals instead. That was the last time they spoke as equals. There's also the strange practice of child handmaidens girls given as companions to daughters of the house, trained to dress, comfort, and entertain them. When the daughter marries, the girl is part of the dowry, traveling with her to a new household, a new life, and new expectations. Always close, never quite family. And yes, some children are trained from birth for specific roles. A boy with a good voice might be groomed as a singer or reader. A girl with a steady hand could be made into a weaver. You once met a child who could recite market prices better than a grown man because that was her only job. Every day, memorize the cost of barley, wine, figs, fish. Never eat them, just list them. But the hardest part isn't the labor, it's the lack of choice. Most children don't know what they're missing. They grow up inside walls that tell them who they are. By the time they're old enough to question it, it's already normal. You once asked a boy named Galen if he wanted to be free. He frowned. Free to do what? That question haunts you. And yet, children find ways to be children, even here. You've seen them giggle behind door frames. You've heard them play games with pebbles and bottle caps, creating kingdoms from nothing. You watched two girls invent an entire song about sweeping, turning drudgery into rhythm. For a moment, the courtyard rang with joy. Then the mistress came, and silence returned. One odd fact. In some rare cases, a child could be manumitted before adulthood, usually because of a promise, a bribe, or a deep debt of gratitude. You heard of a boy freed at 10, who later became a scribe. He returned once to the house that enslaved him. Older, wearing shoes? The master didn't recognize him, but the slaves did. Tonight, the boy in your care falls asleep on your lap. You carry him to his mat and pull a blanket over his feet. He murmurs something, maybe your name, maybe not. Then he's gone to dreams. You sit for a moment in the quiet, and you wonder what kind of stories he'll tell when he's older, if he'll remember you at all. And if he does, what name he'll use. The philosophers are arguing again. You can hear them from the shaded edge of the colonnade where you stand. Back straight, eyes politely lowered. Their voices bounce off the marble like birdsong, except birds rarely use words like telos or natural order. One of them gestures wildly with a fig in his hand. Another rubs his beard like it owes him an answer. You're pouring wine today, because Cleon has invited a group of scholars to discuss ethics, law, and the nature of the soul, all while enjoying lamb skewers and soft cushions. And at the center of it all is the question you carry like a splinter under your skin. Should slaves be free, or worse, are slaves even human? Welcome to the philosophy of hypocrisy, Athenian style. The most famous names are often the most disappointing. Aristotle, revered for his intellect, argued that some people are natural slaves, born to obey, made for labor. He believed these souls lacked the reasoning capacity of free men, and thus belonged by nature beneath them. You hear the quote often, even if not directly. It echoes in the way people look at you. It hides in the way they speak around you, but not to you. And yet, these same men debate the virtue of justice, the structure of the ideal state, the harmony of the cosmos. You once watched a philosopher spend 20 minutes praising moderation while drinking his 4th cup of wine. Historians still argue whether thinkers like Aristotle genuinely believed in natural slavery, or if they were justifying a system they found convenient. It's hard to tell. After all, philosophy in Athens was rarely divorced from reality, and that reality ran on enslaved labor. Still, not all were blind to the contradiction. Socrates, for example, had his doubts. At least as recorded by his students, he sometimes challenged the social order through questions. always questions. He poked at assumptions, asked whether virtue could exist without freedom, whether obedience made someone lesser or just better adapted. Then again, Socrates never freed a slave either. As far as you know, Plato built entire cities in his head. Callipolis, his imagined utopia of philosopher kings, carefully organized by class and function. Slaves are mentioned, but only briefly, as if they were part of the landscape, not absent, just background. You think of yourself standing here, silent and still? Are you background, or are you the quiet listener who hears everything? In a strange way, you know more than they do. You carry water for the thinkers who discuss virtue but don't fetch their own wine. You clean the floors where they debate morality. You remember every syllable. Sometimes you quote them back to yourself. Late at night, you imagine correcting them. Once, during a symposium, a guest asked if any slave had ever shown virtue. Another replied, "Yes, but only as a reflection of his master's guidance." You had to leave the room so they wouldn't see you smile. There are occasional philosophers who take the conversation further. A few cynics question property, entirely arguing that ownership is unnatural and social conventions are lies we tell ourselves. One even suggested that the truly wise man would be enslaved in body, but always free in mind. You think of that often, not because it's comforting, but because it's the only kind of freedom currently available to you. Some philosophers do free their slaves, usually in old age, as if releasing others just before death cancels the years they held them. You once knew a man who freed all 3 of his household slaves a day before he died. An act of virtue, his nephew said. You thought it was an act of guilt. There's another twist. Some freed slaves become philosophers themselves. Rare, yes, but real. You once heard of Phaedo of Elis, a slave who was freed and later became a student of Socrates. Imagine that. Going from property to prodigy, from fetching figs to questioning truth itself. But what does it mean, really? You serve thinkers who build logic like temples, and yet none of their arguments erase your bruises. None clean your hands. None give you choice. And still, you listen. You listen when they say, "Justice is giving to each what is owed." You whisper to yourself, "Then what do I deserve?" You listen when they say, "The unexamined life is not worth living." You think I examine every breath, every step, every silence. You listen when they say, "The soul is the seat of reason." You wonder, what about mine? What does it see when I close my eyes? And sometimes, when the room is empty and the echoes of philosophy have died down, you sit where they sat, you speak their words aloud, you answer their questions with your own. You build a quiet argument made of lived truth. Tonight, as you wash wine cups and fold cushions, you consider the greatest irony of all: the people who speak most about freedom are often the ones who've never needed to imagine it. But you imagine it every single day. And maybe, just maybe, that makes your thoughts more valuable than theirs. It's market day in Athens, and the streets are a jangle of shouting vendors, flapping awnings, and the hot, sharp tang of olives, fish, and sweat. You're carrying a basket of grain, following your master's wife at a few respectful paces close enough to assist, far enough to be ignored. As you pass between the stalls, you notice the way eyes glance at you, then slide away. Not curiosity classification. You've gotten used to being seen as a type. Because in ancient Greece, who you are isn't defined by your personality, your dreams, or your favorite festival food. It's shaped by your accent, your origin, your skin, and your demeanor. You're not just a slave. You're a Thracian, or a Scythian, or a Phrygian, or a Cretan, and that means certain assumptions follow you like your own shadow. The Greeks love their categories. Thracians, supposedly wild, passionate, good for physical labor and dangerous when angry. Phrygians, soft-voiced, musical, perfect for domestic work. Syrians, cunning, clever, often placed in administrative roles. Scythians, archers, always archers. You once joked that if a Scythian was born blind, they'd still hand him a bow. Historians still argue whether these ethnic stereotypes were based on observed traits or simply projections of Greek fantasy. But you live it. Every time someone asks where you're from, they're not being polite. They're placing you in a mental chart, deciding your value. You, personally, are from somewhere north of the Black Sea. You think you were taken young. Your Greek is smooth now, but people still squint at your vowels. Once, a vendor asked if you were one of those dream-telling types. You weren't sure what that meant, so you nodded. He paid more attention to you after that. Foreignness in Athens is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes you exotic, entertaining, mysterious, useful. On the other, it marks you as other, alien, untrustworthy. A man might admire your singing and still not let you walk through his front door without a chaperone. And the irony, almost all slaves are foreign. Athens has laws against enslaving its own citizens, so the economy depends on imported humanity. You're one of thousands captured in war, bought in markets, shipped across seas, a living trade route, speaking dozens of dialects behind closed doors. You hear them in the kitchens, in the workshops, in whispered lullabies and quiet cursing, a whole world of tongues beneath the dominant one. Once you served wine to a table of men who began joking about how Thracians can't hold their drink. You knew 4 of the words before they ever reached your ears. You smiled as you poured. They never knew you understood every insult. Another time, you met a slave girl who passed as a Greek. Her skin was pale, her voice fluent. But one day she dropped a word in Lydian, and everything changed. Suddenly she was difficult, deceptive, too clever for her place. She cried that night, not because she was caught, but because she had tried so hard. You learn, over time, that speaking Greek perfectly doesn't make you Greek. It makes you convenient. That's all. And some masters lean into the stereotypes. One man made his Phrygian slave wear soft red shoes because he believed it matched their delicate temperament. Another kept his Scythian servant in leather armor and forced him to pose with a bow during dinner parties. Performance, not personhood. Not, and yet, despite it all, you find camaraderie among the others. You learn to read faces, not languages. You trade stories in half-phrases and shared looks. In the storeroom, you once laughed until you cried with a girl from Korea after both of you dropped a jar and tried to blame the wind. There's a strange power in being categorized. You can choose how much to reveal. If they expect you to be stupid, you stay silent and listen. If they expect you to be clever, you give answers just short of correct. You learn how to perform their expectations while guarding your real thoughts like buried treasure. And sometimes the stereotypes flip. You met a man once, Nestor, from Egypt, who used his foreign mystique to gain influence in the household. He told fortunes, healed headaches, recited dreams. The master's wife started consulting him before major purchases. He was still a slave, but not an ordinary one. He wore his difference like armor. You wonder if you could do the same. But mostly, you keep your head down. You carry the grain. You speak when spoken to. You smile the neutral smile that makes people comfortable. And at night, lying beside the kitchen hearth, you dream not of freedom, but of being seen without filters. not as a Thracian, not as a servant, not as a clever or clumsy or well-behaved member of some imagined tribe, just as a person, a whole one, with a name no one's decided for you. The sun is still climbing when you're summoned again, this time not to a feast or a field, but to a small, dim room tucked behind the atrium. The walls are cracked. The lamp flickers like it's unsure whether it wants to stay lit. And in the center of it all sits a man with ink on his fingers and a stylus behind one ear, shuffling through wax tablets with the absent-minded frustration of someone who knows he's misplaced something important. "Sit," he says, without looking up. "You do, because you're about to spend the day navigating the strangely bureaucratic world of ancient slave law, where the rules are blurry, the roles confusing, and your rights are complicated. You are officially property. That's the foundation of the system. You can't vote, sue, or marry in the eyes of the state. You can't own anything. And if someone kills you, well, technically, that's just a property dispute, like smashing a valuable pot. The killer might have to pay compensation to your owner, not your family, not you. But here's where it gets messy. You're also a person who can be blamed, punished, even tortured to get the truth. In fact, that's one of the darkest corners of Greek law. Slaves were often tortured as witnesses in trials. The reasoning a slave would never tell the truth unless they were afraid for their body. A citizen might lie for honor. A slave, a whip tells no lies. Historians still argue whether these confessions were reliable or just screams shaped into words. You suspect the latter. You once overheard a trial where a house slave was interrogated about a theft. His answers were choked, contradictory, desperate. But the magistrates nodded like they'd heard divine truth. He was later sold off, far from Athens. No one asked if he had lied to end the pain. No one wanted to know. And that's just the legal side. In daily life, you can be punished at will by your owner. There's no appeal, no trial. If your master beats you, that's his right. If his neighbor does it, though that's a problem. Not because you were hurt, but because your master's property was damaged. Some city-states had laws protecting slaves in theory, but not really in practice. In Athens, you weren't supposed to be assaulted by a stranger, but only because it was seen as a violation of your master's dignity, not yours. One odd loophole. You could own things, but not really. Let's say you're a public slave, a clerk or assistant, and you're paid a wage. That wage technically belongs to the state or your master. But sometimes it accumulates. Sometimes it buys your freedom. So, is it yours? You once met a slave named Peritus, who saved for 10 years to purchase his manumission. He kept the coins hidden in the false bottom of an urn, collecting interest through a friend. When he finally made the payment, the magistrate said, "See how generous his master is." You wanted to laugh or scream. There's also the matter of contracts. You can't make one, but people can make them about you. You can be hired out, rented, assigned duties for another household. There's no discussion, just new orders, new floors to scrub, new hands to avoid, and God's help you if you're caught escaping. That's when the real cruelty kicks in. Escape isn't just betrayal, it's disruption, an insult to the system. Some escaped slaves are branded with the word fugitive burned into their skin. Others are paraded in chains to make examples. You once saw a man forced to wear a heavy wooden collar with iron spikes, so he couldn't rest his head or lie comfortably. "He'll think twice next time," the master said. There's no due process for you, but there's still law. A strange, lopsided law that defines your existence without your consent. And yet, sometimes you find ways to use it. You once saw a clever girl from Corinth convince a judge she was illegally enslaved. She spoke with such clarity, such undeniable force that the court had no choice but to investigate. Turns out, her master had forged documents. She was freed that day. It was rare. Miraculous, even. But it happened. You keep the memory like a smooth stone in your pocket. Cold. Real. Proof. Another wrinkle: if your master dies, you don't automatically gain freedom. You become part of the estate. Inheritance by inheritance. Willing or not, you pass from hand to hand like a slightly used lamp. Some masters write freedom into their wills. Some don't. Some change their minds at the last moment. You once saw a scroll torn in half because a son wanted to keep the slaves his father had promised to release. He must have changed his mind, the son said, smiling. He hadn't. And then, strangest of all, you learn that sometimes slaves are allowed to punish each other, usually if one has been promoted to oversee the others. It creates a bitter hierarchy, a system of fear within fear. You've never envied those supervisors, they're often hated, and the masters like it that way. Tonight, as you leave the magistrate's chambers, your hands still dusty from sorting records. You think about how many contradictions you carry. You are a person but not protected. You are property but still punished. You are named but not acknowledged. And somehow, through it all, you walk with grace, with quiet, with the knowledge that even when law forgets you, you still exist. And that's something no decree can erase. The night is quiet. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the type that hums with questions you're too afraid to ask aloud. You lie on your pallet, wrapped in a thin blanket, and your thoughts drift somewhere they rarely go. Not to labor, not to hunger, not to fear, but to death. What happens to a slave when they die? No one's ever explained it clearly. You've watched free men receive elaborate funerals, oil lamps lit, coins placed gently in their mouths for Karen, the mythical ferryman who carries souls across the river Styx. You've seen wailing mourners, fresh linens, carved gravestones with proud inscriptions. Here lies Ariston, beloved son, friend to the gods. You've cleaned the floors after their feasts, scrubbed away their tears. But for someone like you, there's no promise of coins, no procession, just the quiet shuffle of being forgotten efficiently. You once knew a man, Bothos, a fellow slave who worked in the gardens. He had a gentle way with the fig trees, always humming, always polite. One morning, he didn't get up, he didn't groan, he didn't move, just a stillness too still. By noon, he was gone, not in spirit, in body, hauled away on a cart without ceremony. No priest, no marker, just dirt and quiet. Historians still debate how often slaves received proper burials in Greece. Some say those with kind masters might be cremated and given a small grave. Others believe most were dumped in potter's fields, mass graves outside the city walls, where the poor, the unnamed, the enslaved ended up buried without rites. You wonder what happens to the soul of someone who was never recognized as a person. Does Karen accept your coin if you never had one? Does Hades welcome a name that was never yours? Is there a place in the underworld for the invisible? Some say the gods see no status in death, that in the afterlife, all souls walk alike. But others whisper that even the underworld mirrors the world above, that kings dine in Elysium, while slaves drift as shades in asphodel, forgotten and voiceless. You want to believe the first one? You need to Still, there are stories. You heard of a slave named Phoenix who worked in a temple and died suddenly. His fellow slaves pooled scraps of coin to offer a small ritual, a bowl of wine poured out beside the hearth, a song sung in a dialect no one else understood. He was buried behind the sanctuary wall. Someone carved a tiny bird on the stone. They said the gods would recognize that symbol if nothing else. Another time, a freedman named Machion paid for the burial of the slave who once raised him. She was my mother more than the one who bore me. He said, he wept at her gravesite. Later, his relatives called it shameful. He said nothing in return. You've wondered what would happen if you died tomorrow. Would your body be carried gently? Would your name be spoken? Would anyone pause? Or would the kitchen simply go quiet for a day? Would your blanket be folded and passed along to the next pair of hands? There's a dark comfort in knowing you're not alone in this uncertainty. You talk sometimes, late at night, with Helot, the old nurse. She believes that souls return, that people like her, like you, are reborn again and again, until they live a life where they can die remembered. I've been here before, she says, as a bird, a tree, a whisper. Next time, I'll be a man with sandals and a scroll. You smile when she says that, because she deserves it. And maybe you do too. One curious belief floats through some corners of the city that the Erinyes, the Furies, defend the unburied dead. That if a soul is left without a grave, without ritual, they become a restless spirit, and the gods send vengeance on those who denied them dignity. You hope that's true? Not for revenge. For justice. Tonight, you light a lamp for Bothos. You place a pebble beside the flame. Just one. Small. Smooth. Meaningless to others. But in your heart, it says you were here. I saw you. I remember you. And perhaps someday, someone will do the same for you. Not because you were owned, not because you served, but because simply you were... The courtyard smells of damp stone and lavender today. A rare breeze weaves between the fig trees and over the roof tiles, stirring the dust without lifting it. You sit quietly on a stool, mending a tear in a tunic you'll never wear, and for once, no one is shouting your name. No one is barking orders. The house is still. And in this quiet, your mind wanders not to the next chore, or the next meal, or even the next wound, but to legacy. Because despite everything, despite the silence, the erasure, the chains, you were here. And the world still carries the fingerprints of people like you. The temples, with their towering marble columns, scrubbed by slave hands. The scrolls of Plato, preserved and copied by public scribes, many of whom were slaves. The very streets of Athens, worn smooth by countless feet. Yours among them. You who bore water, who carried wine, who watched and remembered. Historians like to write about heroes, generals, poets. But the truth is, most of the ancient world was built by people who never got named. And maybe that's the real story. You knew a girl who spun thread so fine. It looked like spider silk. Her cloth dressed the wives of senators. No one remembers her name. You knew a boy who could recite all of Homer's epics from memory. He never owned a scroll. He died young, but you still hear his voice in your head. You knew a man who repaired amphorae so well you couldn't see the crack. His work sits in a museum now. The curator calls it anonymous. And you've done all these things, taught, cleaned, lifted, listened, and you've done it with no statue, no coin, no olive crown. But here's the quiet truth: the entire system depended on you. Your labor, your endurance, your memory, even now, long after your hands have gone still, traces of you remain. in the wear on a temple stair, in the groove of a cart path, in the fading record scratched on wax, where your name may once have hovered, then been scraped away. You were the ones who caught the philosopher's words when he dropped them. You were the ones who lit the lamps before speeches, swept the dust before processions, poured the wine before peace was declared. You made the world function, and you did it while being denied personhood. Some of you were eventually freed. Others vanished. Others, like a few lucky sparks, had your stories preserved by accident scribbled in the margins of someone else's scroll. Historians still debate how much we'll ever truly know about ancient slaves. The records are sparse, the voices filtered, but that doesn't mean you were silent. It just means no one wrote it down. Until now. And maybe, as strange as it sounds, your legacy isn't a statue or a poem or a speech. Maybe it's in the quiet strength passed from one forgotten soul to another. Maybe it's in the knowledge that you mattered, even if the world pretended otherwise. Tonight, the house is quiet. The fire flickers low. Outside, the wind stirs the leaves like pages of a book. You listen, for once, not to commands but to your own breath. You are tired, but you are here, and you're still thinking, still remembering, still resisting, even in rest. Because even now, long after your name was lost, long after the scrolls have faded, you lived. And in that living, you left a mark the world can't quite erase. Wind down 300 words. Now, let your shoulders loosen. Let your breath stretch out like silk across the night. Feel the last traces of stone walls and olive branches fade into quiet air. The echo of footsteps softens. The weight of the past releases its grip. One slow sigh at a time. You've walked long roads, through dust and darkness, through whispered prayers and hidden songs. You've seen the lives history forgot the quiet, the invisible, the essential. And now, you let these stories settle, like dust upon parchment, gently, silently, waiting to be remembered. No need to hold on to the names. They'll come back when they want to. Just breathe. Let the hum of the world quiet itself around you. Let your thoughts untangle, like threads slipping from the spindle. You've done enough for today. There are no more tasks, no more commands, just a gentle stillness. The stars above Athens shimmer without judgment. They ask nothing. They know nothing of status or station. They simply shine. And under their light, you are neither slave nor servant, you are simply human. Resting, breathing, drifting. Let that be enough. And if, in your dreams, you walk again through marble halls or olive groves, may you do so freely. May your footsteps leave soft impressions, not in dust, but in peace. You are safe now. You are seen. You are remembered. Sleep well,